Welcome to the Two Matts and a Jeff podcast. This is our second podcast, and on this episode, we plan on reviewing our top power forwards in the NBA. I'm Matt Moyer, joined with Jeff Moyer and Matt Bannon. Again, Two Matts and a Jeff podcast. We hope that you'll enjoy a little conversation, a little distraction from all that's going on in the world today. Just talking some sports here with some middle-aged fellas. So, Jeff, why don't you start with your list? This is power forwards from the NBA. So all-time NBA. So we're going to start with, we have at least our top 10 listed, but we'll start with our top 5 and go from there.
Yep. All right. So I was just saying to them that my 5 and my 6 were so close. So I have my 5 as Kevin Garnett. He had one MVP. He was a 15-time All-Star. He won one championship, averaged 18 points per game and 10 rebounds per game, and he had longevity. He was in the NBA for 21 years, and this is why I was debating between him and my 6th person, because my 6th person, I'm just going to say, because I was debating on Bob Pettit. Because as I was looking him up, I didn't know much about him because he was older, obviously, than us. His numbers were staggering to me. However, he only played 11 years. So that's why I kind of dropped him to 6. So I'm not going to go over all his stats. But so anyway, I decided I would go with Kevin Garnett as my 5. My 4 is from our team, the 76ers, Charles Barkley. He had one MVP. He was an 11-time All-Star. Unfortunately, never won a championship. Probably because, like a lot of other guys that played with Jordan, didn't have that opportunity. He had an opportunity, I should say, but could not win it. He averaged 22 points per game, 12 rebounds per game. And what's, I think, so impressive with him, and why I kept him at 4, I was debating on moving him up, but what's so impressive is that he was only 6'6".
That's probably an inflation too.
Yeah, but I mean, like, I compared to all these other people, like, his size, for a power forward was way less than a lot of these other guys. So he was my number 4. My number 3 was Dirk Nowitzki. He had one MVP. He was a 13-time All-Star again. He had also longevity. He played for a long time. He won one championship. 22 points per game and 8 rebounds per game. So I had Dirk Nowitzki as 3. Number 2, I had the mailman, Karl Malone. 2 MVPs. I didn't remember he won the second one. I knew he won the one. He was 14-time All-Star. Again, kind of like Charles Barkley, no championships. But he was 25 points per game, 10 rebounds per game. And when I looked that up, he's like 12th all-time. And second all-time in scoring.
Yeah,
really.
second all-time.
Second all-time in scoring. So that's what it is. He's second all-time in scoring, but his average of 25 points per game is 12th all-time. That's what I was trying to go. He's 12th all-time in his scoring average per year. And then my number 1 is Tim Duncan. Looking at Matt's shirt here of the Spurs. 2-time MVP, 15 All-Stars, 5 championships, 19 points per game, and 11 rebounds per game. So Tim Duncan is my number 1.
So my list has some similarities. When I look at the power forward position, there's a lot of different things that I want to look at with that guy. I want a guy who has a low post presence, so when the center's not in the game, he can take over and do that. But he also, got to have some other skills at the power forward. You got to be able to pass the ball a little bit, so assists matter, rebounds matter a lot, of course. But I also want a guy that can shoot the ball a little bit, the jumper, the turnaround jumper. In today's game, you're even looking at stretching that out a little bit with some of the guys. And a guy that made my list, which is on yours, Dirk Nowitzki, has those kinds of skills. So my list has some similarities, but there's definitely some guys that are in a different position. I have more than 5, as we know we all do, but I'll start with my number 5. And my number 5 was Karl Malone. So I know you're going to say he's low. Here's my argument about why Karl Malone is not as high. Because I think without John Stockton, he doesn't score all those points. I think the benefit, so try to look at a pure player. So you listed titles in your stats. I don't even look at titles in the stats of an individual player so much because there's so many other things that go into a title. Charles Barkley has no title, and neither does Karl Malone. but they have a lot of other guys around them that help them out. So I think Karl Malone's stats, while great, I just was not a big fan of his in a lot of ways. And I think that he benefited from the best passer in the game of basketball ever in getting a lot of those points. So that's why I have him at number 5 and not a little bit higher on my list. My number 4 is Dirk Nowitzki. So 20.7 points, 7.5 rebounds, 2.4 assists. And he's got some great stats there. Big guy, longevity, like you mentioned. He was in the league for a long, long time. Class act, a really good player, and I think a guy that some people might have on their list a little bit higher. My number 3 was Barkley. And, when we look at his stats, 22.1 points, 11.7 rebounds. 11.7 rebounds, 6'6", which I don't think he even was 6'6". How many drafts have you guys heard where they say this guy's the next Barkley, and he never is? I've heard that a bunch of times. Barkley is such an anomaly for a power forward, a guy that's only his height that could do what he could do. His jump shot game was not that great, but his statistics are amazing for a guy his size, just incredible.
Well, I was going to say with his size, besides his height, his weight. I mean, think about how nimble he was. He was, not the sveltest of players. So,
And he carried a lot of teams without, as I mentioned with the centers and a lot of stuff. He was Batman. He didn't have a lot of great Robins to go along with him. Like Karl Malone had a great Robin to go along with him. Charles Barkley never really had that. Late in his career, chasing a title, he teamed up with some guys that were pretty good, but it was just too late. They were all too old. So my number 2 is Kevin Garnett. A longevity, just a guy that I think was an incredible player and versatile. He had the big man skills, but he had a lot more of those 3 skills that you look for in a guy more than just a 4. I think he was an incredible player. 1.4 blocks a game average for a career, which I think, over the course of a long career, that matters. And my number 1 was Tim Duncan, just like you. I mean, again, he's just Mr. Consistency, 19.3 points, 10.9 rebounds, a long career. One of the things with my list, and you're going to see later on when we get into some of the other guys, I was trying my best to only put guys on that I really legit saw play. I couldn't do it. Because some of these other guys, like you mentioned, your 6 and later on my list, which we'll talk a little bit more, there were just some guys that I couldn't help but put on because their statistics matter. But in my top 5, these are all guys that I really saw, with my own eyes play. And I think it's hard to judge some of the other guys. Their statistics are pretty impressive, though. So that's where I fall out. 5 Malone, 4 Nowitzki, 3 Barkley, 2 Garnett, and 1 Tim Duncan. Matt, where do you fall with your guys?
All right. Well, my list pretty much compares to your guys' list from 5 to 1. I have Dirk at 5 just because, for me, even though he had 7.9 or whatever, the 8 point, whatever you said for rebounds or whatever, when I think of Dirk Nowitzki, I don't really think of a defensive player. I mean, not saying he didn't play defense or whatever, but for me, his strength is offense. So, and I put him at 5 because like a stretch 4. Now everything's sort of a stretch 4, and that's what I view him as. Actually, when I started researching, I don't really think Dirk played the 4, but I think of him as more of a 3. Just because, I didn't really look into it, but I wonder if I really looked into lineups.
Did he play 3?
Did he really play the 3 more often?
Right.
Especially later in his career now when the NBA is the way it is or whatever.
It makes some legitimate points there, Matt, in terms of, that 3-4 and the defensive part, which is something I think we need to get into with some of these guys. Some of their defense was weak, so it's a great point as to why he would be a little bit low on the list.
Yeah, and you guys know me. Defense is my thing. So, anytime D comes up, you'll see in the next a few of the guys here that I have about D. So, and like you guys said, 1 ring, 1 MVP or whatever. So, my 4 is Kevin Garnett. My biggest thing with him was he's a 12-time all-defensive player. So, when I think of Kevin Garnett, I don't think he had a great jump shot, which I don't really think of him as, but he did. But I just think of him as intensity and D. He made his teams better. As you guys know, I'm a Lakers fan, so when he was with the Celtics, I hated his guts. So, but he made them better. Even though they had Paul Pierce was their really offensive guy, and Ray Allen could nail it down, so that was their big 3 when that year they won. But I think he's the reason they won that year because he just made the whole team better.
Well, that's another really good point, Matt, is that, you got to look at guys that make the team better. And as we get into some other lists, there's some guys that I'm going to make arguments, of course, for that never made their team better and why they might be lower on the list. That is, to me, one of the hallmarks of a great player is, do they make their team better?
Right. Yeah, exactly. My 3, I think, how many guys both had? Barkley at 3. So I had Barkley at 3 as well. I think that Barkley gets a ring if a lot of players. Barkley gets a ring if MJ's not around or whatever. That year that Phoenix played the Bulls in that series or whatever, he was in. That was at his peak, I think. 93 around there when they played the Bulls in the final. That was his peak. And the one thing I had written down for him that I remember sticks in my head with Barkley, of course, the 6'6", 6'4", whatever he was, and the leaping ability at that, and just the relentless rebounding, is that I heard from multiple sources from the Dream Team scrimmages that he was supposedly the best player on the floor for those scrimmages, during the scrimmages. Now, maybe Jordan or someone didn't turn it on during those, but from what I remember hearing from all that coverage and the books and everything, that he turned it on and he basically was the best player on the floor. So you think about who was on the floor at that time. Magic, Jordan.
Well, Malone was there too.
Malone.
Yeah, like the guys were
all
comparing
those guys
to.
that, and I remember the Dream Team games. This is going way back. You guys, youngsters, don't remember this probably, but going way back, the Dream Team games. A lot of the games, he was a leading scorer. Now they didn't need Jordan or someone to step up and score, but Barkley sticks in my mind as that in the era that he probably wasn't actually the best player because of Jordan, basically. That during the Dream Team scrimmage, where all the best players in the world and probably the best team ever, he was viewed as the best player by a lot of people who watch those.
Well, when you think about one of the things, Matt, you mentioned about defense, and who did Charles Barkley play defense on? He was playing defense on centers. He was playing defense on Shaq. He was playing defense on sometimes the biggest guy on the floor. Why? You don't put Charles Barkley on a guy that's 5 or 6 inches bigger than him unless his defense matters and he can handle it.
The other thing about Barkley is he could take a defensive rebound and take it down the floor.
The whole floor, yeah.
He would do that as well, which, you see a lot of guys doing in today's game, but, back then you didn't, they'd kick it to the guard, but he'd bring it up. Yeah.
So my 2 is Karl Malone, but you're as you were talking, you're making me think, Matt. But my 2 is Karl Malone. A big thing for Malone is just the longevity, like you were talking about. I mean, second all time in scoring. I mean, a lot of his baskets.
And he played for all those years. It's not like he didn't decline his points per game.
Right. A lot of those baskets definitely. I mean, he doesn't obviously have the skills to. He's not a one-on-one player. Never was or whatever. But he had post moves and everything. But the pick and roll was his bread and butter with Stockton. So you're right. If he doesn't have Stockton, there's no way he's even top 10 all time in scoring. So.
And I don't want to degrade the guy, but I just never thought his game was smooth or pretty to watch in terms of his offense. But he certainly knocked down the shots because when you look at 25 points per game for his career, and he went long because he went into those years where he played with the Lakers. Trying to chase the title at the end, and didn't get it. There's something to be said for that. So.
Yeah. And of course, my number 1, like you guys, is Tim Duncan. I mean, like you said, Mr. Consistency, by far the best bank shot shooter ever. I mean, it was like a given. If it was going glass from the wing or whatever, it was automatic or whatever. I mean, I know you said, about the rings, about as far as that doesn't matter or doesn't matter as much. For me, again, we talked about this the last episode, rings are a big thing for me just because I know we're looking at individual players, but it's a team game. Again, it's sort of like you make your team better, that type of thing or whatever. So rings, and again, I think of Duncan, I think of rebounding as well, and I didn't realize he was a 15-time all-defensive player. And you don't really, you don't think of him as blocking a lot of shots, but just his presence and everything when the defensive end.
And to think that he played with the Admiral, and if he won those defensive guys,
right.
Well, the most fundamentally sound power forward, sounds like we all agree, of all time.
Well, plus he had the nice bank shot. He always
Well, he had a lot of skills.
What I was going to say is, when you look at it, we all had the same 5. Just different rankings. But I mean, if you look at all those players, body types were very different. Like Garnett was a skinny, whatever. Barkley was,
the round mound of rebounds.
Right. I mean, so physically they're all different. Size is different. All those different things about those guys. Yeah.
Well, I think you got to look then too at because all of our lists go more than 5, and who else do you have on the list? Because like I said, when I tried to put my list together based on guys that I really just saw play, and I was going to come in here ready to say these are my guys up to 10, and I could put the top 5 in guys I just saw play. But I wonder, in guys we didn't see play, if we were 20 years older, if our top 5 lists, which are the same guys in different order, would be different. Because when you look at I'll give you a couple on my list. I'm not going to go all the way to 10 because I want to give you guys a chance there too. But my number 6 is a guy that we all saw play, Kevin McHale. Is my number 6, and I think again he's fundamentally sound, great defense, a lot of blocks, 1.7 blocks, 7.9 points, and a lot of times coming off the bench for that, and just a fundamentally sound guy. But my number 7 is a guy I didn't want to put on my list because I never saw him play, but Bob Pettit.
That's right.
And that's my number 7. 26.4 points, 11-time All-Star, 2 MVPs, 16.2 rebounds for his career. I couldn't not put him on my list because those statistics were just overwhelming. Right. But the question would be, how does he size up against a Tim Duncan, a Kevin Garnett, a Charles Barkley, a Nowitzki, a Malone? How does he size up against those guys if they're going head-to-head right now? I don't know the answer.
Well, that's why I said I had him at 6, and when I looked at, and like I said, so his points per game average is 8th all time. And his rebounds per game is 3rd all time. So, he's way up there. But then that's why I said when I really started looking, he only played 11 years. So, no wonder, he kept those averages up, like where we mentioned, where, Kevin Garnett played 20 years, and he kept, not as high, but it's still a very high average. So anyway, Bob Pettit was my 6. I had Kevin McHale, and when I started looking at numbers and stuff, I just dropped him to 9, only because, when you were mentioning about needing other players, he never was the man on that team. Obviously he had a lot of the other great players.
Well, that's what, just to interrupt you for 1 second, that's where McHale, you think about it, on a team with a bunch of other stars, he still had some pretty great statistics, and I think that's part of the reason, and maybe a little bit of the titles did bleed in on that guy for me, Matt, and a little bit of the fact that I saw him play over some of those guys.
Right. Well, plus you're a post player, and his post moves.
He was
the up and under post guy.
Well, and he was very traditional power forward player.
Well, so if we're going to go through what I have, my 7th and 8th guy were both guys I didn't play. And I think I had this one guy as a center. Because I know it's interesting when you look at various lists. Some lists had Tim Duncan as a center.
Yep. Well,
this guy, Elvin Hayes, I think I might have had him on my top 10 as a center, but now he's in my top 10 as a forward. So I had him at my 7. I had Dolph Schayes, so another guy never seen play, but when you look somebody up with numbers, he was a 12-time All-Star. He won a championship, 19 points per game, 12 rebounds per game, and he was 19th all-time in rebounds per game. And then rounding out my top 10, I was debating on who my 10th would be. And going kind of with what you were saying, this guy, you didn't want to play against him ever, but you would want him on your team. Dennis Rodman, I had 10. His numbers, he was only 2-time All-Star, but he won 5 championships. And I think that goes well with, he's the role player. He did his job, because he only averaged 7 points a game. So he was not but he averaged 13 points a game, 13 rebounds a game, which was 12th all-time in averages. So, he was, like I said, a role player. So when you think about a 4-spot guy, a power forward, if you're going to have the scorer and the shooters and everything else, why not have that guy, on there? So I have a couple other honorable mentions, but
Matt, what do you got?
Yeah.
So I'm similar to your list from 6 and 7. So I have McHale at 6. I think of McHale as best post footwork ever. I mean, he just lulled you to sleep, not lulled you to sleep, but just his footwork was amazing in the post. Again, as a Lakers fan, watching that was heartbreaking. but that's what I think of McHale. And really, in those days when he was in his prime, he was really their second option. I mean, it was Bird, and if Bird wasn't on, it was McHale in the post. I mean, Parrish got his, and DJ and Danny Ainge got theirs, but McHale was really their second option. So, but yeah, at 17 point, I didn't realize when I looked it up, 17 point, 8 or 9 points a game or whatever. I didn't realize his scoring average was that high or whatever. But that's what I think of. Oh, and by the way, I didn't realize that he actually had like 1.7 blocks per game.
Yeah, I had that down.
Yeah,
which is pretty impressive.
I never thought of him as a block shot, but I also have the 1.7 blocks a game and 1 clothesline. As we all know what that is on Rambus. So yeah, I had petted it.
Well, it's a different era of basketball.
Oh, totally.
But that, and something we do have to talk about is the fact that there's not a lot of young guys on our list here. None at this point.
Well,
but we'll look at. Different era, tough-nosed basketball, and I think that a guy like a McHale, he can play in any generation and would be a successful player.
Yes.
Some of the other guys not so sure, but he didn't take any crap from anybody.
Nope.
Never.
No, and I mean, even as a Celtic, I respected that. So my 7 was Pettit, I think, like yours was, and I don't know where 7.
He actually was 6.
6, okay. Yeah. So yeah, and again, I didn't know either the stats. I mean, I was just like, what? How does this guy get this many the stats like that or whatever? And what I have here for him, I just think. Even with those stats, so even if he played in maybe not today, but in the 80s or 90s or whatever, you know, he might not get 26 and 16, but if someone who gets that, they're going to get 20 and 20 and 12,
20 and 10,
yeah,
20
and
12,
10, whatever, yeah, which is amazing when you think about it. My 8 was Elvin Hayes, again, the whole center power forward thing or whatever. When I think of Elvin Hayes, I think of him as like he just seemed to me to be in that era of the NBA where it was a little down. So like the mid to late 70s. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people don't think of him. But if you really go way back, I know we're not really talking college, but if you go way back, he beat Lou Alcindor in college. He broke UCLA's streak or whatever in college or whatever in the Astrodome or whatever. So he's just, I think he's just obscure. People don't think of him, but I think he was a better player than most people think. So he was my 8. My 9, which maybe in some of your honorable mentions, maybe or not, but Chris Webber. And the thing that I like about Chris Webber, which I didn't know, is he averaged 4.2 assists per game. You think about that from a power forward. I don't think anybody else on my list was even at 3 assists per game. I'd have to look, but 4.2 assists per game from the power forward spot or whatever. It's almost like when he was with the Kings or whatever. He was like who they ran things through or whatever. You know, they weren't going to run through Vlade or whatever. But
he makes an honorable mention on my list for sure.
Yeah.
So a guy that never seemed to get over the hump. I think that the challenge with Webber for me was the expectations were really high, and he was good, really good, but never got to the level of what I think the expectations were for him.
And honestly, you know, not to, but you know, he's very good. He's very good on TV now too. I think he's pretty good. You know, but,
Yeah, I like him on TV. And my 10 was the same as yours, Dennis Rodman. I had a tough time putting it at 10 just because of 7.3 points per game, but just the unbelievable contributions on the defensive end, rebounding and defense or whatever. I mean, I put down, which I didn't realize he was actually Defensive Player of the Year in 90 and 91, which I had no idea about. I mean, I knew he was a great defensive player, but I didn't realize that he was a Defensive Player of the Year, 8-time All-D. And I just, when I think of Dennis Rodman, I just think of the best rebounder in history, just because a lot of guys maybe had the relentlessness to, like Barkley, to get the rebounds or whatever, but for Rodman it was almost like a science or an art.
Well, I remember in the documentary, they talked about how that's, you know, he studied, which I when you think of Rodman, you wouldn't think of but he did film study.
Well, what Rodman did, which is different from any other player, maybe any player I can think of, was he decided offense was not what's important to me. Right. Because if you look at his game early in his NBA career, his offense was better. Later in his career, his offense actually got worse. Like, he's not a guy I want shooting the ball. Like, his jump shot was ugly. Right. I mean, but he made a calculated decision that this is my contribution to make my team better. Yeah. And he did that better than anyone. Yeah. Better than anyone, I think, in the history of the game. And not the tallest guy, not the strongest guy, but he studied, like you said. He said, I'm going to get every rebound. And nobody played harder than Dennis Rodman, and no one wanted to win. There are guys that wanted to win just as much as him, but nobody wanted to win more than he did. And he was willing to say, I'm going to sacrifice certain statistics because, you know, what was the first statistic out of all of our mouths? Points per game. He didn't care about that with his lousy 7.3, but he wanted 13.1 rebounds a game as the average.
And the defense.
So was that? Did you round out your 10 there?
That was my 10. Yeah.
All
So
right.
who do you guys
so,
have?
so I didn't round out the rest of my 10. I had Elvin Hayes at 8. Again, we've said a lot about him. Now, my 9 and my 10, I got a guy here you guys haven't listed in. My 9 or my 10, I think I could interchange. But I put Rodman at my 9 for all the reasons I just said. And just, he's a guy you want on your team. But you got to be the right kind of coach for him. Yes. But my number 10, I put a guy in that is an active player right now. Somebody that, and it was hard because the guys now, I don't know, they didn't make our list, but I put Anthony Davis as my number 10. Now, maybe that's premature. Maybe. But right now he's averaging 24 points, 10.4 rebounds, 2.2 assists a game. We'll see what the rest of his career has for him. But I put him as my number 10. He's been an all-star, I think, 7 times. And just a guy that I think has a very similar skill set actually to Kevin Garnett in a lot of ways, in my mind, I think. He rounded out my top 10. I want to get into my honorable mentions, but go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I put Anthony Davis on my honorable mention. He was my today's player. And then my other honorable mention was Paul Gasol. Because again, he had, he averaged a double-double every game, 18 and 10, and 5-time All-Star. But yeah, Anthony Davis was one of the guys I put as my honorable mention.
Yeah, and I actually had a pretty big list here of honorable mentions. Just guys that I think of as great power forwards. Not all their statistics, not all the titles necessarily, but a guy that I think gets lost there, Matt, like Elvin Hayes in some ways, is Larry Nance. 17.1 points a game, 8 rebounds. Sean Kemp, who I know we love for his power. I had on there Chris Webber was an honorable mention. Gasol. Rasheed Wallace I have as an honorable mention too. I think there's a guy that, his reputation is not great, as he's not the nicest guy in the world, but he was a pretty great player. And I put as an honorable mention at the very end of my list, just because I don't think he gets enough credit for the titles, Horace Grant. His numbers are not exceptional, but I think when you look at, and again, titles don't weigh in a lot, but I think he doesn't get enough credit for what he did for some of those teams. And he had a pretty good run there with a lot. He contributed. He made his team better and served a pretty big role in some title teams for the Bulls and stuff.
Yes, he did. So my honorable mentions. So I had Dolph Shaves in there, or whatever as well. Pau Gasol. I actually had some other players that you guys didn't have. And what's crazy is when you guys mentioned AD, I guess whatever lists I looked up must have been, not whatever. I didn't even have AD, and as a Laker fan, that hurt me. I was like, oh my God, how did I forget AD or whatever, now that he's a Laker. But other guys that I had.
He may be a 3 on some lists.
Yeah, right. You're right. Other guys that I had that go back a ways or whatever. Jerry Lucas. So I remember him late in his career as a Knick. So I'm older than you guys, obviously. And so when he played with the Knicks late in his career, I remember him. And he averaged 17 and 15.6. So
I saw him on the lists when I was like...
Yeah, again, I don't know, a different era. I don't know if he does that because I think his career ended early 70s or whatever when the Knicks won their title or whatever.
The last time they were relevant, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. You got that right.
Well, no, they were relevant in the 90s. They just didn't win anything.
Yeah. Let's see what else did I have on there. Chris Bosh. I was surprised. I didn't realize Chris Bosh averaged 19.3 points per game. Now, a lot of that was when he was in Toronto.
He was the man in Toronto.
Or whatever. But I just didn't realize that he averaged that many. Another old school guy, Dave DeBusschere, was a Knick. Again, when I grew up, back in the day, cable, whatever, WOR out of New York, Channel 9, and DeBusschere, but he averaged 16 and 11, which I was surprised or whatever. So, and the last guy I had on, a guy that as a Laker fan I really didn't care for much either, was Amari Stoudemire. He averaged 19.9 and 8.1 or whatever. Now, he was sort of like Malone.
Steve Nash. Yes.
Yep, without Steve Nash,
Yeah.
I don't think Amari Stoudemire gets anywhere near those numbers or whatever. So he's from a one-on-one player, an individual player or whatever. But I was just surprised that he averaged that much. But those were my honorable mentions. But the ones you guys mentioned, the other guys
Well,
you
because
guys
I
mentioned
think,
too.
especially with, as basketball is going to keep progressing, when you start looking at all-time lists, it's going to be interesting because, especially with positions, the 4 spot, the power forward, going at a 4 rather than a power forward, I think is how the NBA is going. And if you think about the guys that get drafted, I look at the guy from Villanova who got drafted to Golden State.
Pascal.
Like isn't he like a?
No, he's like a 4.
Yeah, he's like a 4 who never would thought he was a 4. You know how he plays the game because he shoots and that stretch 4 thing.
That's what
so
it
that's
is
why
today.
that's what I mean. So like so some of these guys I think could play in today's game. Some of them are kind of like the centers when we talked about last time. The game is just different. So some of these guys may or may not be able to play in today's game just because of if they can shoot or not.
Well, and
And guard.
the power forward like a Kevin McHale, that position almost doesn't exist today. Like there
He
aren't
might
a
be
lot.
a 5 today.
Yeah, he might be a 5 today. There aren't power forwards who make their home down on the low post. But I think that to me, at least when you're talking power forward, traditional power forward, it's a guy who can step in for the center when he's out if you got no backup center and has those kind of well-rounded skills. And that's what I was really looking at, a lot of well-rounded skills. The guys that can dish the ball out a little bit and those kinds of things matter. Interesting, we develop our list independent of each other. We all had the same top five, but they were all different except for number 1, which happened the same thing with centers, which is that we all agreed who the best player was. Tim Duncan, but the rest, a lot of intermixing there. And if you're starting a team right now and you need a power forward, if Tim Duncan's not available, which guy are you taking, kind of thing. So interesting, and you're right. Like I don't know 5 years from now where you put the power forward position and who would be on that list, because some of these guys, like an Anthony Davis, for example, or whoever, that 4 position is just, it's almost like 3 or 4 is interchangeable anymore.
Well, and it's hard to judge, like you said, with today's game, because the Lakers nowadays, at the end of their game, AD's Anthony Davis is at the 5 and LeBron's at the 4.
Right.
So that's like crazy.
That you mentioned that. I was going to say, we were talking about body types, how they're all different.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that Karl Malone, who was a power forward, all-time 5, is the same body type as LeBron James.
Yep.
Like his height, his weight is the same.
Well,
Yet LeBron plays totally different. He can obviously post and all that, but I mean it's just again the different game now. But they're the exact same body type.
Yeah, I saw that statistic recently. Like the weight is the same, the height is the same,
And his body.
To me, LeBron is just 99% muscle. Where Malone, who was a strong guy, you look at his physique and he doesn't have that same kind of chiseled, muscular physique that a LeBron has. But you're right, LeBron can play any place on the floor he wants to. But I would never think of him as a 4 ever, and I would never think of Karl Malone as a 3 ever.
Or 2,
like,
or bring
yeah,
up the ball. He would never bring up the ball.
And LeBron can do all of those things. So we'll see when we get into other lists where he falls. But interesting. And like I said, interesting that we had a similar top 5, but not agreed upon who's where. I think an argument can be made either way with a lot of those things.
That's a good point of having good discussions.
Yeah.
Any last words on the power forwards, guys?
No, I think as I already said. Like I said, it just the evolution of the game is going to definitely change these players. So,
Well, that's our list for this time. Our top power forwards. You've been listening to or watching the 2 Matts and a Jeff podcast. This list was power forwards. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.